Chapter 1. The First Day. As Jamal stepped onto the campus of an all-white high school, his heart pounded. He had fought for this right to receive an equal education, but now, standing in the hallways filled with unfamiliar, unwelcoming faces, he questioned whether he truly belonged. The stares followed him everywhere, some curious, others filled with disdain. Some students whispered to one another as he passed, their words just loud enough to sting but not clear enough to confront. His footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence that seemed to engulf him. Even the teachers seemed unsure of how to react to his presence. A few nodded stiffly, offering forced smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Others simply ignored him, acting as if he were invisible. The walls of the school felt like they were closing in, as if every corner of the building had been designed to remind him he was an outsider. As he made his way to his locker, his hands shook slightly. He focused on his breathing, steadying himself. He had prepared for this moment, replaying it over and over in his mind. But no amount of preparation could fully brace him for the reality of it. The weight of history pressing down on his shoulders, the legacy of segregation still lingering in the air. He reminded himself why he was here. His mother's words rang in his mind, "You belong anywhere you choose to be." Taking a deep breath, he squared his shoulders and lifted his chin. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his steps. With renewed determination, he turned toward his first class, ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 2. The Cold Shoulders. Jamal quickly realized that silence could be just as powerful as words, and sometimes even more painful. In class, students moved away when he sat down, their chairs scraping against the floor as if his presence alone warranted distance. He could feel their eyes on him, their quiet judgment pressing against his skin like an unbearable weight. In the cafeteria, seats next to him remained empty, forming an invisible barrier that no one dared to cross. The laughter and conversation that filled the room seemed to fade whenever he entered, as if he were a ghost drifting through a world that refused to acknowledge him. The isolation wasn't just social, it was institutional. Teachers, the very people who were supposed to guide him, contributed to the silence. Some barely acknowledged him, speaking only when necessary, while others seemed to deliberately avoid making eye contact. His name was often the last one called for group activities, and even then, it felt like an obligation rather than an inclusion. It wasn't just the students resisting his presence, it was the entire system, an unspoken rule that he wasn't supposed to be here, a reminder that no one had planned for his success. Jamal found himself questioning his decisions. Every day felt like walking through an invisible storm, where the winds of prejudice whispered behind his back and chilled his resolve. He saw his classmates forming study groups, helping each other with assignments while he sat alone, struggling in silence. The teachers rarely checked on him, and even when they did, their voices carried a rehearsed politeness, void of genuine concern. But he refused to show weakness. He reminded himself of why he was here, not just for himself, but for those who had been denied this opportunity before him. He had promised his mother that he would not give up. He thought of his ancestors, the people who had fought for his right to sit in these classrooms, to have a future beyond the limitations imposed by a divided society. He could not afford to fail. Each day he walked into school with his head held high, determined not to let the silence break him. He told himself that he was stronger than the whispers, the cold stares, and the empty seats. But deep down, he wondered how long he could endure before the cracks began to show. He was fighting a battle that no one else seemed to see, and the weight of it threatened to consume. Yet despite it all, he held on to hope, believing that somewhere in this school there had to be someone who saw him for who he truly was, not an intruder, but a student who deserved to be here just as much as anyone else. Chapter 3. The First Friend. Among the sea of hostility, a single act of kindness shone through. Sarah, a white girl from his literature class, hesitated before sitting next to him during lunch. "I liked your essay on justice," she said quietly, her voice tinged with hesitation, as if she feared being overheard. Jamal was taken aback, not expecting kindness in a place where he had only felt cold indifference. "Thanks," he replied, his voice cautious yet appreciative. Over the next few weeks, their whispered conversations turned into shared laughs, exchanged notes in class, and mutual understanding. Sarah was different from the others. She asked questions instead of making assumptions, listened instead of dismissing. For the first time since arriving at the school, Jamal felt seen. But their friendship did not go unnoticed. Sarah's usual lunch table had fewer people sitting at it now. She started receiving side glances from her old friends, and whispers followed her in the hallways. "Why are you sitting with him?" someone asked her one day. She didn't answer, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Jamal noticed the shift too. Teachers who had previously ignored him now seemed to watch their interactions with interest, some with subtle approval, others with disapproval. He wondered if he was doing Sarah a disservice by letting her befriend him, by allowing her to bear the weight of the same judgment he faced daily. But every time he thought about pulling away, she would flash him a reassuring smile, as if to say, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Their friendship was a quiet rebellion, a defiance against the walls that had been built long before either of them had set foot in that school. And even though the road ahead was uncertain, Jamal knew that for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. Chapter 4. The threats begin. One morning, Jamal found a crumpled note in his locker. "Go back to where you belong." The words, scrawled in jagged, angry handwriting, sent a chill down his spine. He looked around, scanning the hallway, but no one met his eyes. It was just the first of many. At first, he told himself to ignore it. He had expected resistance, after all, but then came the whispers, murmured insults just loud enough for him to hear, but too soft to confront. In class, students would pass notes with crude drawings mocking him. His locker was defaced with slurs, and his desk was vandalized, covered in hateful words. The hostility no longer hid behind polite indifference. It had grown bold, unashamed. Sarah faced backlash as well. Her old friends, the ones she had known since childhood, started avoiding her. Some of them told her outright that she was making a mistake. Others simply whispered when she passed, their judgment clear in their eyes. Rumors spread. Some accused her of betraying her community. Others questioned why she even cared about Jamal in the first place. One day, as they sat together in the library, Sarah sighed and said, "I don't get it. Why does it bother them so much? Why is being decent to you such a big deal?" Her frustration was evident. But Jamal had no answer for her. He had been asking himself the same question. Despite the fear, the anger, and the growing sense of danger, Sarah never wavered. "I'm not going to be another bystander," she told him. And in that moment, Jamal realized something. For all the people trying to push him out, there were those willing to stand beside him, and that, he knew, was worth fighting for. Chapter 5. A Voice Against the Hate. Determined not to let fear control him, Jamal decided to speak up. The weight of silence was suffocating, and he refused to be another victim of quiet oppression. Instead of just enduring the hostility, he chose to challenge it head-on. Late one evening, he sat at his desk, pen in hand, his thoughts racing. He wrote an article for the school newspaper, detailing the daily struggles he faced, the cold shoulders, the whispered slurs, and the outright hostility. He called for change, not just from the students, but from the teachers, the administration, and the entire community that allowed this silent prejudice to thrive. The article was published in the next edition of the school newspaper, and the reaction was immediate. Some students read it with genuine curiosity, others with anger. Some nodded in agreement, recognizing their own complicity, while others dismissed his claims outright. The hallways buzzed with heated debates, whispers of support, and murmurs of resentment. The reactions from the teachers were just as divided. A few quietly commended Jamal for his bravery, offering encouraging nods or brief words of affirmation. But others seemed irritated, treating him with an even colder indifference than before. One teacher, who had always ignored him, now made it a point to avoid calling on him in class altogether. The article eventually caught the attention of the school's principal, Mr. Reynolds, who summoned Jamal to his office. Sitting across from the stern-faced administrator, Jamal braced himself for what was to come. "I read your article," Mr. Reynolds began, his voice measured. "You have every right to express your thoughts, but you need to understand that pushing too hard can create unnecessary conflict. You need to pick your battles wisely." Jamal felt his hands clench under the desk. He had heard this before, advice disguised as caution, but in reality it was a plea to stay silent, to not stir the waters too much. But Jamal knew he had already picked his battle the moment he walked through the school's doors. He met the principal's gaze and responded with quiet conviction. "Respectfully, sir, this isn't just my battle, it's everyone's, and it's long overdue." As he left the office, he knew the fight ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, he felt powerful. Not because he had silenced his fears, but because he had finally given them a voice. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. The tension reached a boiling point one afternoon in the locker room. Jamal had stayed behind after gym class, hoping for a few moments of solitude before heading back into the hallways that always felt too crowded yet isolating at the same time. He was pulling his shirt over his head when he heard the door slam shut. Turning around, he found himself face to face with three students, athletic, confident, and radiating an unspoken menace. Their words dripped with venom, a mixture of mockery and hostility. "You think you belong here?" one sneered. "You're making this school worse. Just leave." Jamal's heart pounded, but he refused to back away. He had spent months enduring their stares, their whispered insults, the vandalism of his locker, but now, standing here with his back against the cold metal, he knew this was different. They weren't just trying to scare him. They wanted to put him in his place. One of them shoved his shoulder just enough to make Jamal stumble slightly. He caught himself and clenched his fists, willing himself not to react. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Strength isn't always about fighting back. It's about knowing when to stand tall. He wouldn't give them the reaction they wanted. Before things could escalate further, the locker room door burst open. Sarah and another student, David, rushed in. Sarah's voice was sharp, commanding. "What's going on here?" The three boys stiffened, their bravado momentarily faltering. David, a member of the basketball team, stepped forward. "You need to back off," he said firmly. Faced with witnesses, the aggressors muttered something under their breath and stormed out, shoving past Sarah and David. Jamal exhaled, his hands still shaking slightly, but he met Sarah's concerned gaze with a nod. "I'm fine," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. The confrontation was reported, and, for the first time, the administration could no longer ignore what was happening. But the response was disappointing. The students involved were given only minor punishments, a slap on the wrist. It was clear the school's system didn't see this as a serious issue. To them, Jamal's presence was a disruption to the status quo. But Jamal wasn't done fighting. This was far from over. Chapter 7. The Unexpected Support. Despite the hostility, Jamal's bravery had begun to inspire others. At first it was subtle, small acts of defiance against the silent segregation that had plagued the school for so long. A few students, both black and white, started sitting closer to him in the cafeteria. Others nodded in quiet solidarity as he passed by in the hallways. The whispers that once carried insults now carried words of encouragement. One day, after class, a teacher, Mr. Collins, asked Jamal to stay behind. "I've been watching you and I admire your courage," he said, leaning against his desk. "I know how hard it must be, and I want you to know that you don't have to do this alone." Mr. Collins, one of the few black teachers at the school, offered mentorship and guidance. He shared his own struggles from years past, reinforcing that change was possible even when it felt impossible. Jamal found strength in these moments. The once empty seat beside him in class was filled more often. Students who had once hesitated to acknowledge him were now standing with him. He wasn't alone anymore. But he also knew that with more voices joining the fight, the resistance from those who opposed change would only grow stronger. The tide was shifting, but the battle was far from over. Chapter 8. The Protest. Determined to bring about real change, Jamal and his growing group of allies organized a peaceful demonstration, demanding an end to the silent segregation that still thrived within the school. They met in secret for weeks, planning every detail carefully. They knew the risks: disciplinary action, social ostracization, and even potential violence, but they refused to back down. On the morning of the protest, students wearing black armbands streamed into the courtyard. They held signs that read "Equality for All" and "Education Without Segregation." The sight was powerful. Students of different races standing together, united by a common cause. Some faculty members watched from the sidelines, some approving, others visibly uncomfortable. The principal, Mr. Reynolds, emerged from his office, his face tight with concern. The protest started with speeches. Jamal stepped forward, his voice strong despite the tension in the air. "For too long, we have accepted silent segregation," he declared. "For too long, we have been told to endure, but today we say no more. We are here to demand the respect and equality that should have never been questioned." As the crowd grew, so did the attention. Local news reporters arrived at the school gates, capturing footage of the protest. Community leaders and activists gathered in support, their presence sending a clear message this was bigger than just one school. The administration could no longer ignore them. Mr. Reynolds approached Jamal, his expression unreadable. "Come to my office," he said. "We need to talk." Jamal exchanged glances with Sarah and David. This was it, the moment where change could either take root or be crushed. Taking a deep breath, he nodded and followed the principal inside. Chapter 9. The change begins. Under immense pressure, the school was forced to confront its deep-rooted issues. The administration could no longer dismiss the voices demanding change. The protest had drawn national attention, and with community leaders, parents, and even legal advocates stepping in, the school had no choice but to take action. Policies that had long allowed silent segregation to thrive were reviewed and rewritten, and teachers underwent mandatory diversity and sensitivity training, ensuring that every student was treated with fairness and respect. One of the most significant steps forward was the formation of a student council for racial equality, designed to give students a direct voice in shaping the school's future. Jamal, now seen as a leader, was one of its first members. The council held open forums where students could discuss their experiences, share their concerns, and propose initiatives to bridge the gaps that had divided them for too long. The changes didn't happen overnight, and resistance still remained. Some students resented the shift, claiming that their traditions were being erased. A few teachers resisted the training, reluctant to acknowledge their past biases. Parents of some students voiced complaints, arguing that the school was caving to outside pressure. However, for the first time, their voices were no longer the only ones being heard. The voices demanding equality were stronger, and they refused to be silenced. Jamal continued to face challenges, but he also saw the cracks forming in the walls that had once seemed impenetrable. He saw students who had once ignored him now greeting him in the hallways. He saw teachers making an effort to foster inclusivity in their classrooms. He saw younger students, both black and white, sitting together without fear of judgment. It was far from perfect, but it was progress. One evening, as Jamal sat in an empty classroom after a long student council meeting, Sarah walked in and sat next to him. "Did you ever think we'd get this far?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. Jamal exhaled, thinking back to his first day at the school, to the cold stares, the threats, the isolation. "I hoped we would," he admitted, "but seeing it happen, something else." The battle wasn't over, but the movement had taken root, and that, Jamal knew, was just the beginning. Chapter 10. A New Path Forward. Years later, Jamal returned to his old high school, now a successful lawyer and activist, his heart swelling with emotion as he stepped through the familiar hallways. The once hostile corridors were now filled with a new generation of students, their interactions no longer dictated by the invisible walls that had once divided them. Laughter and conversations flowed freely between students of all races, a stark contrast to the cold silence he had once endured. As he walked past classrooms, he noticed history lessons being taught with a renewed perspective, discussions of race, justice, and equality that had once been avoided were now openly embraced. The school had evolved into more than just a place of learning. It had become a beacon of change. Teachers who once hesitated to acknowledge racial issues now encouraged open dialogue, and the student-led diversity council, which he had helped establish, remained an influential force in shaping school policies. He made his way to the school courtyard where a new plaque had been placed at the entrance. Engraved in bold letters, it read, "Courage leads to change." Standing before it, he traced the words with his fingertips, feeling the weight of their meaning. This was more than a recognition of progress. It was a testament to the struggle, the pain, and the victories that had led to this moment. As he stood there, a group of students approached him. One, a young girl with wide, determined eyes, nervously stepped forward. "Are you Jamal Carter?" she asked. He nodded, offering a warm smile. "Yes, I am. I just wanted to say thank you. What you did here, it changed everything. I read about your story. Because of you, the school is different. It feels like home now." Jamal swallowed the lump in his throat, deeply moved. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "But remember, change doesn't end. It continues with each of you. Keep standing up for what's right." As he turned to leave, he took one last look at the school that had once been a battleground, but was now a place of hope. He walked away knowing that his silent struggle had not been in vain. It had paved the way for something greater than himself, something that would last for generations to come.